In this session, we will talk about the correlation policy. I'm gonna make a high-level overview of this feature. Moving on, we will talk about the correlation policy components to finally finish with the configuration syntax and an example. What is the purpose of correlation on FMC? The main idea behind correlation is to tie several events together in order to trigger a violation, and at this point also possibly take an action when something happens in our network. Of course, in most cases, we will want to trigger a violation when something bad happens in the network. I would say that in most cases, you will be probably using this feature to automate security decisions. For instance, if FMC sees events of different types that showed up at a certain time, you will want to generate a syslog message and maybe take a network scan. And now, just to give you some highlights, the critical keyword here is going to be events, because the feature is working on events rather than the actual traffic. So we will not be correlating the packets that are flowing via FTD, because the feature is deployed on the FMC itself. And FMC, what management station is going to see is going to be the events, is going to be the logs. So as you use this feature, you will want to make sure that events are actually seen by FMC. So overall, this is something that is slightly similar to a SIEM solution, but I wouldn't say the correlation is meant to replace it. The feature is activated through the correlation policy, which consists of three main components. We have correlation rules, where the rules basically define criteria for violations, and we have two types of rules that we can build. We can go for event types, or we can comply the event types with what is known as constraints. We will talk about these two in more detail later in this session. The second component is a compliance whitelist, which is still a set of criteria for violations, but this time the focus is going to be on individual hosts. There is also that correlation response component, which is meant to trigger an action when a violation happens. So this is optional. You don't have to take an action when the correlation event is generated, but in most cases you will be at least sending the alert to be aware of the event instead of just looking at the logs under the analysis and correlation. And those responses, they can take a form of an alert or remediation. We will take a look at these later in this video. Okay, so as I said, correlation rules are generally built of two types of conditions. We've got event types: intrusion, malware, discovery, host input, connection event. Plus, we can also take an action based on user activity or maybe traffic profile change. All this stuff, the different types of events that we can use to build our conditions, to build our rules, I should say. You can look it up in the doc.cd. Just go to correlation and compliance. Correlation policies is going to be the most important document here you want to look at. We also have a separate section for whitelists, traffic profiling, and remediations. So these three, plus the rules which are documented in the correlation policies, this is what makes the input to the correlation policy itself. If we take a look at the event types here in this document, it shows us the full list of those types of conditions you can use. You can also check out the syntax and the description for each of them. For instance, if we take a look at the discovery event, it shows you what are the possible sub-options for this event and what they mean, what are they used for. Okay, now moving on, the other type of condition you can add as you build a role is known as constraints, which is basically adding some more context to the role. You can build your constraints based on the host profile information, such as MAC address of the device. We can take a look at the identity factor via user qualification. Connection tracker allows you to build some thresholds, add some threshold information about the connection to use this as a condition. We also have a concept of snooze period, which allows you to temporarily disable the rule after a match for a certain period of time. For instance, if our role was configured with a snooze period of 5 minutes, and we take a look at this at time interval 0. This is where we start our policy. Policy is activated at this interval. And let's say that somewhere here at T1, we got a match for the rule. Now this means that until 5 minutes elapses, say that this is going to be T6 when this interval ends, any possible hits before T6, they won't cause the rule to trigger an action. They won't cause the rule to fire. So it's like you temporarily disable the rule to kind of like rate limit the correlation activities. And there is also a concept of inactivity period, which is similar to access lists time range functionality. So this basically allows you to disable the rule at certain times, for instance, within or outside business hours. And more information about those constraints, same as with the event types, you can find it in this document. Let's look for, I'm gonna say, host profile qualification. Syntax for correlation host profile qualifications. Let's take a look at this. Okay, like in the previous case, they show us the sub-conditions, sub-options for this component, and this description is basically telling you what this is supposed to catch. Like when you specify MAC address, it's going to be obviously MAC address of the host. So we've got a lot of options. There are going to be really a lot of different options we will be able to choose as we build the rules. It makes perfect sense to refer to the documentation for at least some of them, but I would say that most are pretty self-explanatory. So you will be able to figure out what they mean just looking at their names. Okay, compliance whitelists. This is another type of rule that we can add to the correlation policy, which focuses on host-specific settings. And a compliance whitelist is built of two components. We've got the targets, which basically tells us what hosts we want to evaluate based on their IP addresses, ranges, individual IPs, and we've got host profiles, which is where we tell what information we want to check in order to determine if the device is compliant with our policy or not. There is also a default whitelist, which is created by Talos. It applies to all endpoints, and it is pre-configured with a bunch of settings. Let's look at this. Let's go to FMC, policies correlation. We're going to take a look at the whitelist tab, and we will take a look at the default whitelist, just to give you some idea of what's inside. Okay, if we take a look at the target here, it says it's the entire network. It's 0/0. So it's going to be looking at, it's going to apply to all end hosts in your network. And if we take a look at the host profiles, for instance, let's look at Microsoft Windows, let's say Vista. Let's check out this one. This is how you select the operating system. We see that the other elements we can check for compliance within the profile include protocols, allowed clients, web applications, and network protocols. So basically, it's a list of operating system along with certain applications and services included or excluded, used to determine if the device is compliant with our policy or not. And notice that the whitelist is kind of like the whitelist rule in the policy is separate from correlation rules, which means that they are evaluated separately. So as you build your policy, I'm going to show you this when we get to the configuration. As you build a policy, you will be able to choose two types of rules, whitelist and correlation. And the last component of our correlation policy is the responses, which you may configure, you may want to use, and in most cases you will, because this is the actions that we can take as the violation occurs. So we can go for alerts, which is notification tool. FMC can send an email, it can send a CCNP trap or a syslog message, where the actual actions are defined through remediations. We can use ICE, Endpoint Protection Service, to, let's say, quarantine a host. We can connect to an iOS device to add a black hole for the prefix, certain prefix involved in the communication. We can perform a network scan with Nmap, and we can set an attribute for a host. We've got a separate section in the documentation for remediations, same as for whitelists. Traffic profiling, this is just one of the conditions that you can use within the correlation rule. You can also take a look at this if you plan to use the baseline, more of like type of condition for the policy. Okay, as you configure the correlation policy, I would personally go ahead and start with the policy components. So I would build my roles, possibly whitelists, then remediations, and also optionally those traffic profiles. So this is something that you can do from the policies correlation menu. We've got rules, whitelists, traffic profiles, and for remediations, this one is located at a different place. We have alerts and instances. Instances are for remediations. So it's going to be over here. We can take a look at the modules for remediations. It is going to tell us what actions are available on this FMC, because you have to install a module for a given remediation to be available in the config. In our case, we will take a look at iOS null route. We see that it is installed, it is active. If you want to use an alert, you want to go to responses here, alerts, scanners, groups, and for remediations, you would go to the instances. Okay, at the end, you want to build a policy and tie all those components you build together. Right, we're going to start our configuration with rules. I'm going to go to policies correlation rule management, and we will build a simple rule where we will focus on connection type of event. I'm going to say create a rule, and I'm going to call it DNS or CSR free, because what I will try to achieve here, we will say that as we see an event that is generated by a DNS traffic coming from CSR free, if this traffic matches our allow rule in the ACP, we will want to add a null route on router 2 for the destination of the DNS packet. And we will use Active Directory device as a DNS server. So we will first and foremost want to make sure that FMC has connectivity to router 2, which in my case it does. If you wanted to add a route for FMC, you would have to go to system configuration and then choose management. This is where you would add a route for the management system itself. In my case, I have connectivity from the FMC to R2. Of course, I will need this because the null route feature is implemented through, I believe, telnet connection. So FMC will have to telnet to R2 to add a static route. Okay, now the traffic itself, I want to emphasize this once again. The traffic itself, which is going to be going via FTD from the inside to the DMZ up to DNS, the traffic itself is not going to trigger the role in the policy. Remember that the feature is working on events, so we will want to make sure that there is an event that will be generated on the FMC as this traffic is seen by our system, by our sensor. Okay, so I would actually want to check, in addition to playing a little bit with routing, I would want to check my access control policy to see if I have a role that allows DNS, which is configured for logging. So I have a role, we check it out, it's just the DNS communication where logging is turned on, and we will add an event to the connection viewer. Okay, so this is okay. I want to cancel here. We will take a look at analysis connection events over here, and we will also open a separate tab for correlation analysis. No, hold on a second. I want to take a look at connections here, and then open up a new tab for correlation events. Okay, so let's go back to the role definition. I'm gonna say that we will be looking at the connection type of events. That's the goal. And we will use few conditions to build the actual role. So first and foremost, we want to look at DNS packets, DNS queries. And we will look at DNS packets that contain a certain string. I'm going to say that this is going to be INE lab. Just INE lab. We will add another condition where we will be looking at the source. So the connection must be originated by CSR3. Client IP address is gonna be, not the client, it's gonna be the initiator IP address. That's what I want to look at. 10.11.11.3. You're gonna change the operator from OR to AND and add one more condition for this type of event. We will wanna evaluate the access control policy action. It's gonna be the rule action condition. So all this stuff you can look up in the doc.cd just to double check the meaning for those options. And the action we're looking for allow. This is what we have in the policy. Okay, optional, you could also add the connection user or host constraint. The snooze timeout, you can put it here. For inactivity period, it's gonna be this option. You will save this rule, and we will now move on to build responses. And specifically, we're gonna build just one response. This is gonna be our remediation. So an action that we will take when violation happens. And the violation is gonna happen when we have a match in this rule. So I wanna choose the iOS null route as a remediation module. I'm gonna say add an instance. I will give it a name, block DNS. Actually, the instance name, this is basically the device you wanna connect. I'm gonna say R2. This is gonna be 172.16.7.2. Username, Cisco enabled password is also Cisco. This is all configured on R2, so we can connect. Whitelist allows you to make exceptions. So prefixes that you never want to block. And then the actual action is configured here at the bottom of the object. We're going to take a look at the block destination option. So we will want to add a route for the destination. And we will also have to give it a name, because this is what we will then refer to in the policy. Block DNS server. We will create this instance. We will save. Okay, click on done and go back to the correlation tab. Now the last thing that we will have to do now is going to be to add a policy with our role. The policy, let's call it CP1. And the roles are added over here. As I said previously, you have two types of roles you can add, which are independent on each other. We've got whitelists for our correlation roles. So I want to add my correlation role over here. And I want to activate, configure an action that is going to kick in when we have a match in this role in that policy. Block DNS server is my action. You can also specify a priority that is going to be displayed when the event shows up in the analysis viewer. You can set the default value or just set a value over here for this rule. I'm going to say that the number is going to be 3. Okay, we will save this. And remember that you don't have to deploy this change. You don't have to deploy this policy because it takes place, it affects FMC and not the FTD. The correlation happens on the FMC. Okay, we will now test this. We will go to the inside device. I'm going to configure this router with a name server. So we will say that DNS queries will be sent to 172.16.10.100. This is my DNS server. And we will enable name lookups. Okay, now in the meantime, let's take a look at router 2's routing table. Let's say show IP route and maybe show IP route static. We will then generate a DNS query. I'm going to say ping test inelab.local. Let's say show host. We won't get any reply, and my DNS server doesn't have an entry for this FQDN. But on router 2, we should see that the route was added. In this case, nothing was added on 2. Let's try to ping once again. This time I'm going to ping something that I can actually resolve, like ESA1. Okay, so we see we are sending the traffic, but the policy didn't kick in because I forgot to enable it. So now I activate the policy. Again, no push is needed to make it work. Let's double check on the device. Let's try to ping once again. And let's also choose a different name to send another query. And let's take a look at that on the FMC. So this time we should see some events. I'm gonna double check events first. And then we will take a look at the correlation events. Right, we see the events in the connection viewer. The action is allow. This is the source, and this is the application, the protocol. We see that the correlation policy kicked in, CP1, rule DNS CSR free. We take a look at the status. We should also see that there is going to be a route added on R2. It's still not here. Let's take a look at this. It says it has a problem logging to the remote device. Okay, this could be a connectivity problem. Let's try to ping to the FMC. 172.16.15.100. Let's say who. Let's try to telnet to ourselves. Maybe I put a wrong IP address, Cisco. Oh, it's gonna be a different username. It's gonna be FTD, not Cisco. I need to go back to fix remediation. So let's do this from here. Let's go to remediation instance, change the username, and this should make the trick. Now we see router to SAS. It was reconfigured by a user FTD. When I say show IP route static, once again, we should see a route to the destination server 172.16.10.100. So key thing to remember about this feature is that you need to see an event that is eventually to be correlated. Because if the correlation policy doesn't get an event, it has nothing to correlate, the traffic itself is not sufficient to trigger the policy.